Hi everyone, welcome back. At the end of the last video, I forgot this last point. I forgot to mention this last point, namely a possibility for writing secondary stress rules besides using this marking of labeling them as iterative. So recall that we've, in this course, occasionally used the notation of a subscript 0, especially with consonants, to mean 0 or more consonants. We can also use subscripts with any number to mean that number or more of some sequence. So if we write C, we want to imagine these zeros as subscript zeros, that is being written small next to the segment here. If we write consonant 1, that would mean 1 or more consonants. Or consonant 2 would mean 2 or more consonants. And this has implications or is relevant for possibly writing a rule in a different way. That is, we could allow that the secondary stress rules will work iteratively, will apply to any sequence if they if there is at least one or more of these sequences of a syllable and then a stressed syllable. So for instance, taking this secondary stress rule from Warao, there, if we write the rule as follows, we'll enclose this this part in parentheses, so followed by a syllable and then a stressed syllable, and then it will have a subscript 1, and this will mean if there is at least one such sequence to its right, or two such sequences. If there were two such sequences, then we would have a sequence syllable, and we've forgotten the word edge here. No, we don't need to reference the word edge, sorry. If we had two such sequences, then it would look like this, and that would assign stress to a syllable that is followed by one syllable, and then a stressed syllable, then another syllable, and a stressed syllable. To make it a bit clearer what I mean here, here you can see on the page with solutions here what this looks like. So we place this sequence in parentheses and place a number, a subscript 1 on it to mean that there needs to be at least one or more such sequences. All right, now we can finally turn to the topic of syllable weight. All of the examples that we've seen so far from Polish, from invented languages, from Maranunku and Warao, have been stress rules that simply treat all syllables as identical. They only look at the position of the syllable in the word with respect to the left edge or right edge of the word. However, stress in many languages is sensitive to so-called syllable weight. And in general, languages that have a sensitivity to syllable weight distinguish phonologically between two types of syllables. Usually a so-called light syllable, where there is a short vowel in the nucleus and no coda consonant. So syllables that have a nucleus and no onset, or any number of consonants in the onset but no coda would be counted as light. On the other hand, a syllable which has a long vowel in the nucleus and a diphthong, also possibly a diphthong in the nucleus, or if it has any consonants in the coda, would count as a heavy syllable. So a syllable with a long vowel, a syllable with a diphthong, or a syllable with a coda consonant. It's worth noting at this point that some syllables do have some more complicated conditions. So there are, for instance, in Lithuanian, only sonorant consonants like nasals, approximants, and approximants, which can count for making the syllable heavy, but in the examples we will look at, languages that treat all consonants as possibly contributing to syllable weight, as possibly causing a syllable to become heavy if they are in the coda of the syllable. The textbook mentions some well-known examples from poetry or song traditions that rely on repeating patterns of heavy and light syllables. This is the case in classical Latin and Greek poetic traditions, but also in Persian verse and Hausa verse. A distinction between heavy and light syllables is needed in the construction of poetic lines. And that these facts, that these poetic meters distinguish between light and heavy syllables, suggests that the people who are writing such poetry have at least some unconscious knowledge of syllable weight. Let's now look at how we can construct some rules that are that distinguish between heavy and light syllables, using an example from classical Arabic, the assignment of primary stress in that language. When we want to proceed step by step, we'll first consider each word and add syllable boundaries to each word, where here a sequence of two consonants between a vowel will always be broken apart in two syllables. So for instance, the sequence, let's see, I find an example here. In the word meaning I broke, kasartu, we would syllabify that as kasartu. And then in marking the syllable weight patterns, we can use this symbol called a brev to mean a light syllable, and this symbol called a macron or macron to mark a heavy syllable. So for instance, the word kasarat would be syllabified as kasar sarat, and this has a heavy first syllable because there is a first syllable because there is a coda, a coda consonant, a light second syllable because there is no coda consonant and no long vowel, and the third syllable is heavy. So we'll come back to doing that. And the final step will be to develop a rule based on patterns of where the primary stress seems to occur. So here we marked in our pattern where the primary stress fell. I'll just quickly make some generalizations. You may want to take the time at home to systematically write out the patterns of light and heavy syllables yourself. But what we can see here is that if we look across the words, in words that have 3 or more syllables, that the primary stress can be on the third to last or penultimate syllable. That's the case in kasarat or kasartuhu. And in both of those cases, the penultimate syllable is a heavy syllable, and the penultimate syllable is a light syllable. So the syllable sa and the syllable tu are both light syllables. And it seems if we compare these two words, that the weight of the last syllable doesn't really matter. It can be either heavy or light. Words that are shorter than 3 syllables, like lan, fakat, and qabla, show that stress is assigned to the second to last or the very last syllable. So this tells us we will want to use parentheses in formulating our rule. But it's not the case that stress is always assigned to the penultimate syllable. Let's look at one other example. The word meaning his library. Here we see primary stress on the third syllable, where again the second to last syllable is light. If we look at all of the examples in the column on the right, however, we see that primary stress can also be assigned to the second to last or penultimate syllable. So we have kasartu, Safar, safartu, kasaruhu, kasarnahu, and katibina. So the difference between the words in the column on the right and the words in the column on the left is that all of the words in the column on the left, these have a light penult, whereas the ones in the column of the right, in the column on the right, have a heavy penult. The penultimate syllable either has a coda consonant or contains a long vowel. So I would suggest making the generalization for classical Arabic that primary stress is assigned to the penultimate syllable if it is heavy, or else to the antepenultimate syllable. One way to approach writing a rule which is going to be fairly complicated, which has a stress rule which would be fairly complicated, one that references syllable weight and which needs to look at words of differing length, is to start by writing a rule that works for words of one syllable and then words for two syllable, and so on. If we begin here with these last three examples, we see that it's clear that our rule is going to need to assign primary stress to the last syllable in a word. That's going to be the case in the word lan. This won't work for words like kabla, but comparing the words kabla and fakat shows us that the weight of the second to last syllable in those cases initially doesn't seem to matter. So in that case, the second to last syllable, the penultimate syllable, simply receives the stress regardless of whether it's heavy or light, and regardless of whether the final syllable is heavy or light. So remember, kabla has the pattern heavy, light, but fakat has the pattern light, heavy. So first, we'll call this our first rule. Then our second rule would simply look like the rule that we've written for Polish. It assigns primary stress to the second to last syllable or else to the final syllable. And it doesn't seem to matter what the syllable weight of the final syllable is. Now we come to the conditions that are somewhat more complicated. So we'll want to assign primary stress to a penultimate syllable that is heavy, but not to a penultimate syllable which is light. The way in which we can skip over a penultimate syllable which is light is by saying that the stress will be assigned to the third to last syllable if the second to last syllable is a light syllable. So, and we'll enclose that in parentheses as well. So departing from this last rule, which contains all of these conditions, we can see it, this rule as being having three versions. So we'll want to have a rule which first assigns a syllable to, which assigns stress to a syllable which is followed by a light syllable and then any other syllable. Then we will want to progressively remove information from the parentheses. So we'll assign the main stress to a word which is just followed by any syllable, first removing the outermost parentheses, or then finally just assigning stress to the very last syllable, the very last syllable of the word. So we have three options. So this says either assign primary stress to the third to last syllable if there are at least two syllables following it and the second to last syllable is a light syllable, or assign primary stress to the second to last syllable, or, and that would be the case if either the second to last syllable is heavy or the word only has two syllables, and in case the word is monosyllabic, assign stress to just the final syllable. You can see exactly what the rule looks like here again too, in case the way I wrote it out here wasn't clear to read. And we can contrast stress assignment in the words kasartuhu versus kasartu. So in kasartuhu versus in kasartu, in this case, in the form on the left, primary stress will be assigned to the third to last syllable because this version, the longest and most complex version of the rule, is able to apply. It finds that there is a sequence of a syllable preceded by a light syllable at the right edge of the word, and so the primary stress is placed on the third to last syllable. In this case, the first version of the rule will not work because the second to last syllable is heavy. So we turn to the version which will simply assign stress to the second to last syllable. And the result is then stress on the penultimate syllable, kasartu. Theoretically, it would also be possible to write a rule which just refers to sequences of consonants and vowels, but it becomes quickly very extremely messy and complex without having syllables and using this notation of a breve and a macron to distinguish between heavy and light syllables. So for instance, we can use the feature plus and minus long to distinguish between heavy and light syllables, and the rule would look something like this. We would still need these sequences of parentheses, but we would instead need to use zero subscripts to refer to sequences of consonants and vowels. So in this case, a vowel would receive the main stress if it was followed by a consonant and then necessarily by a short vowel and then another consonant and then another vowel. So that this entire sequence here would be effectively equivalent to this sequence. This is why another reason why phonologists like to employ syllables, because they greatly simplify our conceptualization of where and when stress comes to be assigned. All right, now that we've carried out this exemplification of the assignment of primary stress in a language that distinguishes between heavy and light syllables, let's take another pause before looking at some particularities of stress in English, and then finally the development of stress in the historical development of stress in French.